I spent my entire childhood being told I didn't belong. My stepmother would stare at me across the dinner table and say just loud enough for my father to hear, "It's strange, isn't it? She looks nothing like you." My sister Alyssa would laugh and whisper to her friends, "She's probably not even really his daughter." For 18 years, I believed them. I believed I was the outsider, the mistake, the one who didn't deserve a place at the table. So when my father died and Alyssa stood up at the will, reading her voice dripping with false concern, and demanded I take a DNA test to prove I deserved any of this, I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was when the lawyer opened the results. The room went silent. Alyssa was smiling, waiting for her victory. Then the lawyer looked up, not at me, but at her, and asked a question that made my sister's face drain of all color. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my family shattered. Have you ever discovered that the person pointing fingers was hiding the biggest secret of all? My name is Candace Harper. I'm 36 years old, and I'm the chief financial officer of a successful consulting firm in Chicago. On paper, I have everything a corner office, a six-figure salary, respect from colleagues who know me as Candace Moore. But there's one thing: I've never had a family that wanted me. I found out my father died through an email, not a phone call, not a tearful message from a relative, a formal 3-paragraph email from his attorney, Martin Chen, informing me that William Harper had passed away and that my presence was requested at the reading of his will. 18 years. That's how long it had been since I'd spoken to anyone in that house. 18 years since I packed a single suitcase at 17 and walked out the front door, convinced that no one would even notice I was gone. As my rental car pulled up the long driveway, I saw her, Vivian. My stepmother stood at an upstairs window watching my arrival. Most people would expect grief on a widow's face, but Vivian's expression wasn't sorrow, it was anxiety. Her fingers gripped the curtain like she was bracing for impact. That look triggered memories I had spent years trying to bury. I was 8 years old, standing in the living room while Vivian examined our family portrait. She turned to my father and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "It's so strange that Candace looks nothing like you, William. Not your eyes, not your nose, nothing at all." I remember the way my father's face tightened, the way he said nothing in my defense, the way Alyssa, only 4 years old, then giggled without understanding why. At 15, I wrote my father letters from summer camp. 5 letters, each one a desperate attempt to tell him how lonely I felt, how much I wanted him to see me. He never wrote back, not once. I told myself he was busy. Deep down, I believed he simply didn't care, and at 17, I accidentally walked into his study and found him crying. He was holding a photograph of my mother, my real mother, who died when I was 3. It was the only time I ever saw him show emotion, but when he noticed me standing there, his face shut down like a steel door. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice cold. I mumbled an apology and left. I never understood why he pushed me away when I only wanted to be close. Now, standing in the foyer of my childhood home, those memories pressed against my chest like stones. The house was filled with relatives I barely recognized. They clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices that stopped whenever I walked past. I caught fragments of their whispers, "Only here for the money." Never visited once. Some daughter she turned out to be. Vivian stayed glued to Alyssa's side, the two of them whispering constantly. My sister had grown into a polished, confident woman, everything I apparently was not. When she finally addressed the room, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted her place in this family. "Before we read Dad's will," Alyssa announced, "I think we should address the elephant in the room. Candace should take a DNA test to prove she's actually Dad's daughter." The room murmured its approval. I watched Vivian nod eagerly, too eagerly. Something about this felt rehearsed. Planned, a trap I was walking into with my eyes wide open, so I did the only thing that made sense. "I'll take the test," I said calmly. "But the will mentions biological children. To be fair, shouldn't all of us claiming inheritance be tested?" Alyssa laughed. "Fine by me. I have nothing to hide." But in that moment, I saw something flash across Vivian's face, just for a second. Something that looked almost like fear. And across the room, my grandmother, Eleanor. My mother's mother, the woman. Vivian had pushed out of our lives decades ago, caught my eye, and gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "Finally." It's time. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I stayed at the house sleeping in a guest room that felt more like a holding cell. The DNA results would take a week, and until then I had nowhere else to go. Part of me wanted to leave immediately to escape the suffocating atmosphere of whispers and pointed looks, but something kept me there. Maybe it was my grandmother's nod. Maybe it was the flicker of fear I had seen on Vivian's face. Or maybe after 18 years of running, I was finally ready to stand my ground. My father's funeral was held on a gray Tuesday morning. Alyssa had taken control of every detail, and she made sure I knew my place. When I arrived at the church, I was directed to a seat in the back row behind distant cousins I had never met. The funeral program was printed on expensive cream paper, listing the Harper family members in elegant script. I found my name at the very bottom in small print under a section labeled Other Relatives. Not daughter, not family, just other. Vivian delivered the eulogy. She stood at the podium in a black designer dress, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she spoke about her beloved husband and our devoted daughter Alyssa. She talked about family dinners and holiday traditions, about the life they had built together. She painted a picture of a happy home, a loving marriage, a perfect family. She never once mentioned my name. It was as if I had never existed at all, as if the first 3 years of my father's life as a parent, the years with my mother, the years with me, had simply been erased. I sat in that back row and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not sadness, not even anger. Just a quiet, bitter confirmation of everything I had always suspected. I was never meant to be part of this family. I was just a reminder of someone Vivian wanted everyone to forget. After the service, as the crowd moved toward the reception hall, I felt someone press a piece of paper into my hand. I looked up to see Rosa, the family housekeeper. She had worked for my father for 15 years, and she was one of the few people in that house who had ever shown me kindness. She squeezed my fingers briefly, then walked away without a word. I unfolded the note carefully, shielding it from view. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. Mr. Harper's study, 3rd floor. He wanted you to see it. I have the key. I found Rosa in the kitchen an hour later washing dishes while the reception continued in the other room. She dried her hands and looked at me with tired eyes. Your father kept that room locked for years, she said quietly. He told Mrs. Vivian it was for confidential company documents, that it had a special security system. She tried to find the key many times, but she never could. Your father kept it at Mr. Chen's office in the safe. Rosa paused, and I saw something painful cross her face. After his stroke 8 years ago, your father could not speak properly for a long time. Mrs. Vivian, she controlled everything. Who could visit? What phone calls he could take. She screened his mail, his messages, everything. He was like a prisoner in his own home, and there was nothing any of us could do. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small brass key. Mr. Chen gave this to me after your father passed. He said you should see what is inside, alone. The 3rd floor of the house had always been off-limits when I was growing up. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding with each step. The hallway was dim, the air thick with dust and silence. At the end of the corridor, I found the door. It looked ordinary, just another wooden door in a house full of them. But when I turned the key and pushed it open, I stepped into another world. The room was a shrine. That is the only word for it. Every wall was covered with photographs of me. Not the kind of photos you find on social media, but professional surveillance shots taken from a distance. Me walking to work. Me at a conference. Me laughing with colleagues at a restaurant. There were newspaper clippings about my career achievements, printed articles featuring Candace Moore, CFO. He had tracked my entire adult life without me ever knowing. On the desk, I found a thick file folder. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The first document was a DNA test dated 12 years ago. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. The test showed that Alyssa Harper had no biological relationship to William Harper. My sister was not my father's daughter. Below that were medical records from when Alyssa had needed a bone marrow transplant. A note from the doctor explained that William had volunteered to be a donor, but testing revealed he was not a genetic match. That was how he had discovered the truth. There were trust fund documents showing that my father had been sending me money for 10 years through Martin Chen. I remembered that money. I had thought it was a grant for women entrepreneurs. I had applied on a whim and been shocked when I was selected. It had helped me survive my first years in Chicago when I had nothing. It had never been a grant. It had been my father watching over me from the shadows. There were divorce papers signed and finalized 5 years ago. My father had divorced Vivian. But for Alyssa's sake, he had allowed them to continue living in the house. And then in a separate envelope, I found something that made my throat close up completely. Dozens of letters still sealed addressed to William Harper in my own teenage handwriting. The letters I had sent from summer camp. The letters I thought he had ignored. Someone had hidden them from him. He never even knew I had written. But somehow eventually he had found them. In the center of the desk, placed as if waiting for me, was a single letter in my father's handwriting. The script was shaky and uneven, clearly written by a hand weakened by illness. It was dated 2 months before his death. I picked it up and began to read. My beloved Candace, I have failed you in ways I can never fully explain. When your mother died, I was broken. Vivian appeared, and I was too weak to see what she really was. By the time I understood, it was too late. 12 years ago, I discovered that Alyssa is not my biological daughter. Vivian had been pregnant by another man when we met. She lied to me for 20 years. I wanted to tell you immediately. I wanted to bring you home. But then I had the stroke, and Vivian took control of everything. I could not speak. I could not write. I could not reach you. By the time I recovered enough to act, I was afraid you would reject me, that I had lost you forever. So I did what I could. I watched over you from a distance. I sent you money through Martin. I collected every piece of your life I could find. I kept your letters, the ones Vivian hid from me, and I read them every night, hating myself for my silence. The will is my last act, my only way to give you what you deserve. I am sorry I was never brave enough to fight for you when I could. I hope this can be enough. Your father who loved you always. The letter ended mid-sentence. He died before he could finish. I was still holding the paper tears streaming down my face when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I grabbed the most important documents and turned just as the door swung open. Alyssa stood in the doorway, her face pale. Her eyes moved from my face to the papers in my hands, and I watched the color drain from her cheeks. "What," she whispered, "is that?" For the first time in 18 years, I saw genuine fear in my sister's eyes. Fear of something she did not even understand yet. I did not answer Alyssa's question that night. I simply gathered the documents, walked past her frozen figure, and locked myself in my room. She did not follow me. She did not demand an explanation. Perhaps some part of her already sensed that the truth would destroy everything she believed about herself. The next 3 days passed in heavy silence. Alyssa avoided me completely. Vivian watched me with barely concealed panic, trying to gauge how much I knew. And I waited, saying nothing, holding my cards close until the moment they would matter most. The will reading was scheduled for Friday morning at Martin Chen's office downtown. The room was small but elegant with leather chairs, arranged in a semicircle facing Martin's oak desk. Vivian arrived first, dressed in black, as if still performing the role of grieving widow. She positioned herself in the center chair, shoulders back, chin high. Alyssa sat beside her, but I noticed she had moved her chair slightly away from her mother. My grandmother Eleanor took a seat in the back corner, quiet and watchful. I chose a chair on the opposite side of the room from Vivian, the folder from my father's study resting in my lap. Martin began by explaining the legal framework of the will. He spoke in a calm, measured voice, but I could see him glancing at Vivian as he read the key passage. Mr. Harper added a special clause to his will 2 years before his death, Martin said. It reads as follows. My estate shall be distributed solely to my biological children. All parties claiming inheritance must consent to DNA verification. Anyone who refuses testing forfeits their claim. DNA samples for comparison have been preserved with my attorney. I watched Vivian's face as Martin spoke those last words. Preserved samples. For a moment, her confident mask slipped. Her eyes widened just slightly, her lips parting as if she wanted to object, but could not find the words. She had not expected this. She had assumed that with my father dead, there would be no way to verify anything. She had built her entire plan on that assumption, and now she realized perhaps for the first time that my father had anticipated her. Martin continued, as both Miss Candace and Miss Alyssa consented to DNA testing, and as Mr. Harper provided his own DNA sample before his passing, we now have conclusive results from the laboratory. He picked up a sealed envelope from his desk. The room went completely silent. I could hear Vivian's shallow breathing, could see Alyssa gripping the arms of her chair. Martin opened the envelope with a letter opener, unfolded the document inside, and began to read. Candace Harper confirmed 99.99% biological match to William Harper. I exhaled slowly. Beside me, I heard Vivian let out a small breath of her own. She was still hoping, still believing that somehow this would go her way. Martin was not finished. Alyssa Harper, he continued, his voice steady. 0 biological relationship to William Harper detected. No genetic markers in common. The room erupted. Alyssa leaped to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. That is impossible, she shouted. There has been a mistake. The lab made an error. Run it again. She spun toward Vivian, her face twisted with desperation. Mom, tell them they are wrong. Tell them. But Vivian did not move. She sat frozen in her chair, her mind clearly racing, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The silence stretched for 3 long seconds. Then Vivian recovered. She stood, her voice sharp and commanding. This is obviously a conspiracy, she declared. Martin Chen has always favored Candace. Everyone knows that. He probably tampered with the results himself. I had been waiting for this moment. I opened the folder in my lap and pulled out the DNA test I had found in my father's study. Then explain this, I said calmly. I held up the document so everyone in the room could see it. This is a DNA test from 12 years ago. My father already knew the truth. He found out when Alyssa needed a bone marrow transplant, and he volunteered to be a donor. The doctors told him he was not a genetic match. That is when he ordered this test. I looked directly at Vivian. 12 years. He knew for 12 years that Alyssa was not his daughter. Vivian pivoted without missing a beat. That proves nothing, she snapped. He accepted Alyssa as his daughter anyway. He raised her. He loved her. Legally, she is still entitled to... Martin interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. Mrs. Harper, or should I say Ms. Vivian Shaw, since your divorce from William was finalized 5 years ago. Vivian's face went pale. You have no legal standing in this room, and Alyssa's claim to the estate depends entirely on biological relationship per the explicit terms of the will. Vivian turned to Alyssa, her voice suddenly pleading. Don't you see what they are doing? They are trying to steal your inheritance, your birthright. We need to fight this together. We can hire lawyers. We can contest the will. You knew. Alyssa's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through Vivian's desperate monologue like a knife. She was staring at her mother with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness. Something closer to horror. You knew I was not his daughter, Alyssa said slowly. You have always known. Vivian's mask cracked. Alyssa, sweetheart, I was protecting you. Everything I did was to protect you. You have to understand. Protecting me. Alyssa's voice rose, trembling with rage and pain. You spent my entire childhood telling me that Candace was probably illegitimate. You made me treat her like garbage. You convinced me that I was the real daughter, and she was the imposter. And the whole time... Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth, struggling to breathe. The whole time it was me. I was the one who did not belong. She turned to me, her eyes wet with tears. Did you know before today? I held up the file from my father's room. I found out 2 days ago. Dad knew for 12 years. He never told anyone except Martin. He loved you despite everything, Alyssa. That is why he stayed silent. He could not bear to hurt you. I paused, then looked at Vivian. But your mother, she knew from the very beginning, from before you were even born. Martin cleared his throat. Mr. Harper left a letter to be read at this time. He picked up the final document from his desk and began to read my father's words aloud. The letter explained everything. How Vivian had deceived him when they first met, how he had discovered the truth 12 years ago. How his stroke had left him helpless, trapped in his own home, while Vivian controlled every aspect of his life. How he had watched over me from a distance, sending money through Martin, collecting every piece of my life he could find. How the will was his last act, his only way to make things right. When Martin finished reading, the room was silent. Vivian stood alone in the center of the room, abandoned by everyone. Alyssa sank back into her chair, staring at nothing. She did not look at her mother, did not look at me. She simply sat there, hollow and broken. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered to no one. And for the first time since childhood, I looked at my sister and felt something I never expected. Not triumph, not vindication, just the hollow ache of recognizing another broken person. The weeks that followed the will reading were filled with paperwork, legal meetings, and the slow unraveling of everything Vivian had built. Martin walked me through the full scope of her downfall during one of our sessions at his office. The prenuptial agreement she had signed 32 years ago left her with nothing in the event of divorce. She had agreed to those terms eagerly, back then confident that she would never need to worry about such things. But my father had also discovered something else during those final years. Vivian had been embezzling money from household accounts for over a decade, siphoning funds into private accounts she thought no one knew about. When my father found out, it nullified any claim she might have had to marital assets. The divorce had been finalized 5 years ago, but my father kept it quiet. He did not want to humiliate Alyssa publicly. Even after everything, he still tried to protect the daughter who was not his. Vivian came to collect her belongings on a Tuesday afternoon. I was waiting in the living room when she arrived. She looked smaller, somehow diminished. The confident woman who had controlled this household for 3 decades was gone, replaced by someone